What's the real cost of debt for county government? I'm Jill Horner. This is Comcast Newsmakers. With me this hour is Tom Kovach. He's the president of the Newcastle County Council. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, Jill.
When we talk about debt, and there are certain reasons that debt is in place, you borrow for certain infrastructure improvement projects, but what are the long-term costs associated with debt?
Well, that's a very good question because, as a government, as a county, we want to get things accomplished. We want, and we have to incur debt to make sure that we can provide the infrastructure improvements that we need over time, because these aren't things that you can just spend in 1 year and plan. You have to borrow large sums of money for larger projects, but we must do so in a responsible manner and recognize this is not free money. And I think we've lost sight of that. In the last 5 years in our county government, our debt service, what we pay to borrow money, has risen 80% in the last 5 years. That means instead of figuring out ways to tighten our budget and our operating budget and maybe transfer some of that over to our actual capital budget, we're just continuing to borrow money. In our sewer budget, our debt service is now over 22% of our capital sewer budget. That means almost a quarter of that money we're spending on capital improvements for sewer is not going to fix your sewer. It's not going for improvements. It's going for debt service. And that's unacceptable. We've exceeded our own debt limit, which is 20%.
So what happens then if you exceed a debt limit for something like sewerage and sewer improvements? What then happens as you move forward and things like sewers need to be improved? What happens for future infrastructure projects?
Well, the argument is made, well, then you need to borrow more. Because if we're not spending enough now, because we're paying off this debt, then you need to actually borrow more to get a cash infusion to do the projects you want to do. Again, it's a vicious, endless cycle if you do that. My proposal would be to take money from your operating budget. Instead of giving employees across the board 5% raises, make sure that they're based on merit, make sure they're based on performance, and you put that money instead in the capital improvements, which will not only improve our infrastructure and the quality of life for our residents, but it'll also create jobs in this economic downturn when we really need to boost employment.
So when we talk about these infrastructure improvements, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening at this point. And you mentioned the funding mechanism that could potentially be in place. But what are some of the other things that need to occur? And you mentioned sewage, and obviously this is something that's very important for quality of life within a community. But what are some of the other projects that need to be funded? Well,
what we're going to need to fund in the county is stormwater control. Stormwater control is vitally important because when you have a developed society, you have water runoff. In our state right now, you have DelDOT, which controls the runoff from their roads. Then you have the county, which has sewer systems, and we want to generally try to keep the clean water out of the sewer system so it doesn't have to be treated. And then you have the Newcastle County Conservation District, which looks in the flooding issues. There's no central authority that really deals with how we handle our clean water. Make sure it doesn't enter into our sewer system, but make sure it doesn't cause flooding issues, road degradation issues. When you have flooding on roads, that leads to improvements. Obviously, you've heard that DelDOT is going through incredible funding issues, not able to get out there and fix our roads. The less water, the less standing water, the less flooding we have, freezing, thawing, the better our conditions our roads will be in. So we're going to need to shift our focus and concentrate on stormwater control. And if we've borrowed too much, we're not going to be able to pay for that.
And we just have a short time left, but when you look at the short-term funding issues, how much do you then have to focus on what these funding issues mean then long-term in terms of the long-term debt of the county?
Well, as we mentioned in the beginning, right now we can't spend what we need to spend on projects actively because we're spending a quarter of that amount we should be spending on capital improvements on paying off that debt. We need to use operational budget, shift it over, make sure that those projects get done now and not increase our long-term debt.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Tom Kovach. I'm Jill Horner.